Every army enters war believing its weapons will save lives. This tank did the opposite. It broke down, trapped its own crews, and failed so badly that the army using it stopped trusting its own armor. This is the tank that didn't just fail the enemy, it failed its own soldiers. The year is 1939. Europe stands on the brink of total war, and Italy, under Mussolini's fascist regime, is preparing to join what would become the Second World War. Italian engineers had been working on their newest medium tank, the M13/40. On paper, it looked promising. A 47 millimeter main gun, armor plates up to 42 millimeters thick, a diesel engine for better fuel efficiency and reduced fire risk. The specifications suggested a modern fighting vehicle that could stand toe-to-toe with anything the British could field in North Africa. Italian propaganda films showed these tanks rolling off assembly lines in impressive numbers. Newsreels depicted them crushing obstacles and firing their guns with precision. Mussolini's regime promised its soldiers that Italian armor would dominate the deserts of Libya and Egypt. But paper specifications and propaganda reels can hide fatal flaws, and the M13/40 had flaws that would cost Italian tankers their lives. When the M13/40 rolled into North Africa in 1940, Italian tankers quickly discovered they'd been sent to fight in a death trap. The first issue was the engine. The Fiat diesel plant, while innovative for its time, was catastrophically underpowered. The tank weighed over 14 tons, but its engine could barely produce 125 horsepower. To put that in perspective, that's less power than many modern family sedans trying to move a vehicle that weighed as much as 2 elephants. On the flat, scorching deserts of North Africa, the M13 struggled to reach 30 kilometers per hour on good terrain. British cruiser tanks could hit 40. German Panzer IIIs could sustain 35 to 40 kilometers per hour for extended periods. When you can't catch the enemy and you can't run away, you're simply a target waiting to be destroyed. But the underpowered engine created another problem that engineers hadn't anticipated. The strain of moving the tank's weight in desert heat caused constant overheating. Crews would be forced to stop every few kilometers to let the engine cool down. During combat operations, this was a death sentence. Speed wasn't the M13's only problem, not even close. The mechanical reliability of the M13/40 became legendary among both Allied and Axis forces for all the wrong reasons. The suspension system failed constantly. The design, borrowed from earlier light tank models, simply couldn't handle the increased weight. Tracks would throw themselves off in the middle of combat, leaving tanks immobilized and helpless. The transmission, a delicate assembly of gears never designed for the punishment of desert warfare, would grind itself to pieces under the sand and heat. The air filters, supposedly designed to keep out sand, were inadequate for the fine North African dust. This powder-like sand infiltrated everything. It got into the engine, the transmission, the gun mechanisms, and the crew compartment. Tanks would need complete engine overhauls after just a few dozen hours of operation. German officers who fought alongside Italian forces in North Africa documented their frustrations in official reports. One assessment stated that in a typical Italian armored division, only half the tanks would be operational on any given day. And that was before combat even began. After an engagement, that number could drop to 20 or 30%. Field Marshal Rommel himself noted in his diary that Italian tanks required 3 times as much maintenance as German panzers for half the operational capability. Imagine being a tank commander. You're ordered to advance against enemy positions. You know that before you even see the enemy, there's a coin flip chance your tank simply won't make it to the battlefield. Your life depends on a machine that's already betrayed you dozens of times. Every rattle, every strange sound from the engine fills you with dread. Then there was the armor itself, and here the M13's problems became truly deadly. The M13's armor was riveted, not welded. This was an outdated construction method that Italian industry clung to because welding at that scale required more sophisticated equipment and training. But riveted armor had a horrifying flaw that became immediately apparent in combat. When a shell struck the tank, even if it didn't fully penetrate the armor, the impact would shear off the rivets on the interior. These red-hot pieces of metal would ricochet around the crew compartment at lethal speeds, turning the inside of the tank into a death chamber. Italian tankers had a name for this phenomenon. They called it splash, and they feared it more than penetration itself. At least with penetration, you knew where the threat was coming from. With splash, the tank itself became the weapon that killed you. The 47mm gun, while adequate against early British tanks like the A9 and A10 cruisers, became obsolete almost overnight. By 1941, British Matildas and American Lend-Lease grants were arriving in the desert. These tanks had armor that the M13's gun simply couldn't defeat. Crews watched their shells bounce off enemy armor like throwing rocks at a castle wall. Meanwhile, British 2-pounder guns and American 75mm weapons could punch through the M13 at almost any combat range. Italian tankers found themselves in machines that couldn't hurt the enemy, but could easily be destroyed by them. But statistics and specifications don't tell the real story. The real story is about the men trapped inside these steel coffins. The M13/40 had a crew of 4 crammed into a space barely large enough for 3. The commander, gunner, loader, and driver lived in a steel oven that could reach 50 degrees Celsius in the North African sun. There was no ventilation system worth mentioning. The air inside became thick with cordite fumes after firing, making it difficult to breathe. Crews would emerge from their tanks after a few hours looking like they'd been pulled from a sauna, drenched in sweat, gasping for fresh air. Dehydration was so common that medical officers had to enforce strict water ration discipline just to keep tank crews functional. When an M13 was hit, escape became a nightmare. The hatches were small and awkwardly placed. The commander's hatch was the only easy exit, which meant 3 other crew members had to climb past equipment, ammunition, and each other to escape. If the tank caught fire, which happened often due to poor ammunition storage design and fuel tank placement, the crew had seconds to get out. Many didn't make it. Letters from Italian tankers that survived reveal the psychological toll. They wrote of nightmares, of hearing the screams of friends trapped in burning tanks, of the guilt of surviving when others didn't. One letter, discovered in British archives, described the M13 as a tomb we climb into each morning, praying we'll climb out again at sunset. Italian tankers began to dread their own vehicles more than they feared the enemy. They knew the M13 couldn't protect them. They knew it would break down at the worst possible moment. They knew that when they faced British armor, they were outmatched before the first shot was fired. The psychological impact on Italian armored forces was devastating and had strategic consequences. In December 1940, during Operation Compass, the British launched a counter-offensive with just 275 tanks against a much larger Italian force. The results were catastrophic for Italy. The British routed the Italians, capturing over 130,000 prisoners and destroying or capturing hundreds of tanks and vehicles. Italian armored units that should have been able to mount effective resistance simply collapsed. It wasn't that Italian soldiers lacked courage. Numerous accounts from British commanders praised the bravery of individual Italian soldiers, but courage alone cannot overcome mechanical failure and inadequate equipment. When your tank is more likely to break down than fight, when you know the enemy can destroy you at will while you can barely scratch their armor, morale doesn't just suffer, it collapses entirely. German General Erwin Rommel, commander of the Afrika Korps, rarely used Italian tanks in frontline combat roles. He knew they were liabilities that would slow down his mobile warfare tactics. Italian armored divisions were often relegated to infantry support, garrison duties, or used as mobile pillboxes in static defense. The Germans trusted their Italian allies as soldiers, admired their courage under difficult circumstances, but they didn't trust their machines. By 1942, even the Italian military command could no longer ignore the disaster. The M13/40 was officially recognized as obsolete and dangerous. Production shifted to slightly improved models, the M14 and M15, but these were only marginal improvements. The fundamental design flaws remained. But by then, the damage was done. The Italian Armored Corps never recovered its confidence. Tankers who survived the M13 experience carried that trauma into later battles. They'd learned a terrible lesson, one that no soldier should have to learn. Their own army had sent them to war in machines designed to fail. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, some M13/40s were captured and pressed into service by German forces, desperate for any armored vehicles. Even the Germans, facing severe material shortages and willing to use almost anything with tracks and a gun, found them nearly useless. Most were relegated to training duties or static defense positions, where their lack of mobility and protection mattered less. The M13/40 stands as a cautionary tale in military history, one that should be studied by anyone responsible for soldiers' lives. It's easy to blame Italian engineering or industrial capacity, but the real failure was deeper and more troubling. It was a failure of testing, of honesty, of integrity. It was the failure of putting soldiers' lives before propaganda needs and political deadlines. Engineers likely knew about these problems, but their warnings were ignored or suppressed. Every tank that rolled off the production line represented 4 men who would climb inside, trusting their lives to steel, machinery, and the competence of those who designed it. The M13/40 betrayed that trust again and again and again. In war, there are weapons that fail to defeat the enemy. That's unfortunate, but common. Military history is filled with weapons that didn't live up to expectations. Then there are weapons that fail their own troops, that become more dangerous to their users than to the enemy. That's not just unfortunate, that's unforgivable. The M13/40 didn't just lose battles, it destroyed the morale and confidence of an entire branch of the Italian military. It turned brave tankers into victims of their own army's bureaucratic and industrial failures. It stands as a reminder that weapons development isn't just about specifications on paper. It's about the human beings who will depend on those weapons with their lives. This is the tank that failed its own army.